Welcome to the third series of the Financial Geography online seminars. The third series already, it's going really fast with earlier series in the past academic year. I'd like to thank the RSA, the Regional Studies Association, especially Alex and Lisa, who have been facilitating this, having done a lot of work, making this possible, making the job for Stefan Uma, my co-organizer of this seminar series, and myself very easy, because we had to mostly concentrate on getting people to commit to speak here, which turned out to be an easy part of the job, and they will take over the more technical part of the job. I would like to ask you to mute yourself. Most of you, I think, when you come in are automatically muted, but if you have said something at some point, please mute yourself again. If you want to ask questions, we'll take all questions at the end, but you can already type your question in the chat box, or you can just type a Q in the chat box. If you just type a Q in the chat box, I can give you the floor and you can ask your own question, makes it a little bit more lively, but it's up to you. If you prefer to type your question in the chat box, that's fine as well, especially if you don't have a very stable connection. So now it's time, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Rex Mckenzie. He was trained at the New School for Social Research in New York. His 2006 PhD thesis was entitled 3 Essays in the Political Economy of the English-Speaking Caribbean, which leaves a lot of thought for thinking what the topic could be. There's still a lot there with the English-speaking Caribbean, what he could be writing about, but 3 different essays, so maybe I should dig into that one day. He has held positions at the University of Technology in Jamaica, Purchase College in New York State, and the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He is currently senior lecturer at Kingston University in the UK. Rex is a Trust for London grantee and leads the Wealth Change Project, which is a collaboration of social science researchers aimed at gaining a greater understanding of the relationship between property investments coming from offshore tax havens and socio-economic inequality in London. Today, he will present a paper based on this Wealth Change Project. Rex, we're excited to have you as the first speaker of the new FinGeo Seminar Series. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Manuel. First of all, I'd like to thank FinGeo for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to come and share my work with you. And I hope you enjoy the presentation. I just want to say, going in, that this work is done with a group of other people. There are 3. Roland Atkinson from Sheffield University, Shada Rosina from Leicester, and Andrea Ingiani, my colleague at Kingston University. So we've all been involved in this work. Could we go to slide 1, please? Okay, so the presentation I'm going to give to you is slightly different from the one that was advertised. What we had at that time was a working paper. We've kind of worked up the paper a bit more, and here it is. Wealth chain investment in the hinterland. They hold all the cards. Slide 2, please. So what we're going to do in this paper is to concentrate on the purchase of real estate in Merseyside, but not all purchases, just with money coming in from secrecy jurisdictions, from tax havens. We, first of all, want to know the scale and the size of what we're analyzing. We want to know where the money is coming from and where it's going to, and so on. These are basic scoping questions. We ask them because there's not an awful lot of work done in this area, so people have conversations, but there's very little empirics to guide those conversations. Our job here, in part, is to present some hard data for other researchers and interested parties. We also want to know what people think about these developments, what they think about wealth chain investment. We want to know whether they approve, whether they disapprove. And this is because we are particularly interested in ideas and ideology, what makes people think the way they do on this particular subject. So in the later part of the paper, we devote some space to this particular question. Next slide, please. So essentially, the paper is arranged as follows. We've got the theory and methods up first, then we give a social and historical background of Merseyside. We then present our statistical data, then our interviews with key actors. We then have a discussion, and the paper then concludes. The next slide, please. So, dealing with our theory first. We have put on the lens of wealth chains. And wealth chains are defined as transacted forms of capital operating multi-jurisdictionally for the purpose of wealth creation and protection. This is Seabrook and Wigan in a 2017 paper. So the wealth chain is an analytical tool for us. Its purpose is to extract value and to add to the balance sheet net worth. It includes secrecy jurisdictions, as I've said, otherwise known as tax havens, and wholly legal entities. None of the entities involved are illegal. They're all protected and prescribed by the law. Next slide, please. So one of the big things about the wealth chain, it is linked by professional actors. So you've got accountants, you've got bankers, you've got lawyers, you've got estate agents, wealth managers, etc., etc. And all of these professionals are linked in the chain. And our contention is that these chains encompass the entire globe. And as it relates to real estate, the wealth chain connects a secrecy jurisdiction, say in Bermuda, with a specific neighborhood in our cities. Next slide, please. So we see the wealth chain as a pooling device. It's used to merge, it's used to protect and expand the income and assets of capital investors who are generally seeking to maximize their returns. We borrow here from Ertug et al. They see the term device as something that has been used to explain how markets are constructed materially and discursively as a descriptor of markets, as collective mechanisms which produce price and distribute goods. But the term device has other context-dependent meanings. It can refer to a political plan or contrivance, which involves disguise, deception, opportunism, and force. Financial devices are never neutral objective tools with fixed uses and predictable results, because they vary in purpose and effects from one context to another. Therefore, a social device like the wealth chain can be weaponized for the benefit of financial elites at the expense of other actors in society. The next slide, please. Thank you. The second plank in our theory comes from uneven development. What we're really trying to do here is get an understanding of the relationship between the location of economic activity, corporate and state strategies, and spatially uneven development. I don't think I need to go into this in too much detail. Everybody in here, I'm sure, is familiar with uneven development. Everybody, I think, knows the Harvey, Neil Smith, and world systems theorization of Andre Gunder Frank. People might not know the Latin American dependency analysis of Beckford, Best and Levitt, and indeed of Royal Prabesh. However, each one of these writers focuses on uneven development, and we do the same. Next slide, please. Essentially, capitalism is integrally a system that advances unevenly. That is, capital's development is dependent on a process that uses space differentially as part of its strategies in its quest for profits. This applies both globally with center and peripheral countries in the world system, and nationally with the metropole and hinterland dichotomy within nation states. Our contention, therefore, is the northwest of England is a peripheral region. In other words, it represents a hinterland with London as the metropole. The next slide, please. So how does this manifest itself in the political culture? Well, it does so in quite a charged debate between that's described as the North-South divide. Essentially, what this debate says is that we're a divided country. There are resources, services, and well-paying jobs that are concentrated in the South. And in the North, there's a poor, flat-cap population where jobs, resources, and services are all deficient. So this argument, this political argument, is reflected empirically in the indices of deprivation, where Liverpool does rather badly, Liverpool and Merseyside does rather badly, and the Conservative Party notion of levelling up, that is levelling up the North to equalize it with the South of England. Next slide, please. So now we move into a discussion of Merseyside. Essentially, it's 249 square miles of urban, semi-rural, and rural locations with 5 metropolitan boroughs. The latest census figures tell us that the population is 1.4 million people, which makes it the 5th most populous region in England. Liverpool and Knowsley ranked 2nd and 3rd behind Middlesbrough as the most deprived local authority districts in England and Wales. No more is the inequality more pronounced than in the area of health. Diabetes, asthma, cancers, serious heart and respiratory diseases, they're all to be found on Merseyside in greater numbers than elsewhere in the country. I just want to point out here, our reason for selecting Merseyside as an area of interest, as a study, was because we had previously done a study on Kensington and Chelsea. Kensington and Chelsea is the richest borough in the UK, and presumably the richest borough in Europe. So we thought looking at Merseyside, after looking at Kensington and Chelsea, would provide a good contrast. The next slide, please. So what happened to Liverpool, basically starting in the late 90s? It's that it's been repositioned, if you like, rebranded. In 2008, Liverpool became a city of culture. So it's got all the fancy wine bars, all the fancy coffee shops, and that's how it's actually been marketed to the rest of the world now. It's marketed to the rest of the world as a kind of energetic city with a raft of young professionals, and indeed as the place to be. As a result of this, Liverpool has attracted some serious investment from domestic and overseas investors. I've provided some data here that I took from Totally Money. You've got yields of 11.8%, 11.5%, 9.3% in various postcodes in Liverpool. The thing about this is these are far higher yields than other cities like London, which has an average rental rate, a rental yield of 3.05%, and Southampton, which is 3.55%. The next slide, please. So not only is the earnings to price ratio one of the highest in England and Wales, but property prices relative to other cities around the UK are low, with the average home selling for just over £118,000. Property investors can get a lot more for their money than in London, where the average price is something like 490,000. In the year to May 2020, Liverpool saw its average house prices rise by 5.9% above the UK's 4.3% average. And the experts predict that this trend will continue over the next few years. So regeneration in the city is now ongoing as its population continues to expand. And it's now classed as one of the most appealing places in the country to invest in the buy-to-let sector. The next slide, please. So let's talk about the land registry data. The first thing I'd like to say is that we got a good sense of the volume of offshore real estate investment. But we were less certain about the prices for the following reason. There was a total of 2,913 transactions over the period under investigation, but of these, 2,066 had no recorded price. So this limitation of the data meant that we, in turn, were only able to evaluate approximately 29% of the total investment by value. So in order to resolve methodological difficulties in the recording of property prices, we considered the impact of basing our analysis on a measure of real value of offshore real estate investments. But given the magnitude of the total investment flows and relatively low levels of inflation in the last decade, where the highest volume of investments is concentrated, we do not observe significant differences between the distributions of nominal and real offshore investments. The next slide, please. This is what it looks like graphically. The earliest entry in this data was 1972. That was the first time a proprietor was added, which indicates it's the first time that any purchase from the offshore was made. However, from 1972 to 2000, virtually nothing happens. The action begins round about the turn of the century, round about 2000. So what you have in this diagram is annual figures showing you the amount of inward investment. So the total of investment we calculated as 1.153 billion pounds. That is over, mostly over the last 20 years, mostly since the turn of the century. Next slide, please. What we found, and we were surprised at this, and indeed we shouldn't have been, we found that the investment only went to a few postcodes in the city, a handful of postcodes, with the rest of the city getting nothing and the rest of the region getting very little. You can see the L15 postcode eats up the lion's share of inward investment. Now, L15 is a student area. This investment that we see here is aimed at student accommodation. So there's L15, L3, L2, etc., but you can see the tremendous concentration in one or two postcodes. Indeed, concentration is a feature of this work. You get concentration on the top, bifurcation on the bottom, and it repeats itself over and over in the patterns that we see in this type of investment. Could we go to the next slide, please? On a district level, half of the registered properties are in the city of Liverpool itself. I then give you a breakdown of the aggregate amounts of money spent in the various locations. And you will see there that Liverpool totally dominates all other areas of Merseyside. So we observe significantly more variability in the distribution of value of offshore real estate investments than the distribution of volume of such investments. Next slide, please. Okay, so this now hones in on the secrecy jurisdictions. Again, you see the staggering dominance of just one entity or one jurisdiction, that's Jersey. Then you've got the British Virgin Islands. Then you've got Guernsey, Luxembourg, and the Isle of Man. These are the major offshores. The rest get very little, and there are a total of 48 offshores investing in Liverpool property. It's difficult to get behind these numbers because what we've got is just this veil of secrecy and opacity about how the offshores operate. But what we can say from previous work that we've done is that Luxembourg appears to be a corporate offshore. That means the big deals, the big corporate deals, which will come through, will be routed through Luxembourg. There's a comment in chat which is absolutely correct. We think, again, we think. We've got Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man. And we suspect that these are British investors who choose to use the offshore. So we think that there are a lot of people buying second homes, especially in the Isle of Man offshore, more than any others. Why? Because if you look at the Isle of Man carefully, you'll see that there's a kind of inversion or reversal of purchase prices and property prices and number of properties. What we infer from this is These are individuals or families buying houses. The comment on China. China, in the chat that just came up, I'll take it a little bit down the line. It just plays a part in Liverpool, at least plays a part in the interviews that we carried out. So this is the offshore. This is the offshore. These are the secrecy jurisdictions. Jersey dominates, but we've also got the British Virgin Islands, we've got Guernsey, we've got Luxembourg, we've got the Isle of Man. Now, if you read Shaxson does a really good kind of typology of the offshore. And he basically suggests that the offshore, the British offshore, is a vestige of empire, and that the function of the offshore in this period is to kind of gather money, trap money, and direct it at the City of London. That's basically Shaxson, Christensen, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, so in our interviews, we found two recurrent themes. We found the extraction of value and studentification arose time and time again. We had two recurrent names, Peel Holdings and Grosvenor Estates. We found that all bar one of our respondents addressed the issue of offshore investment in the city of Liverpool as opposed to the other districts. This could be a kind of a reflection of the data, because we've already seen that's where most of the investment is taking place. We had one respondent that spoke about in investment in St. Helens. Yeah, next slide, please. Stefan, am I all right for time? Manuel, am I all right for time?
You were doing, you have 5 minutes. You can take a few more if you need to.
Thank you so much. I'm going to jump through some things rather quickly then. Look, we found this quote where in the discussion of Peel by Peel Holdings, the business strategy for Peel was described as such by a guy called Mr. Whitaker, who was the managing director of the Port Authority. He describes the business strategy as such. Mr. Whitaker, who that is the managing director of Peel, the head honcho of Peel, Mr. Whitaker describes infrastructure companies as God's assets. No one can take away land, air, or water. And if that part doesn't work, you still have the land. Okay, we think that's a telling, quite a telling comment. What it speaks to is the extraction of value from land and infrastructure. And what it points our attention to is the role of rent, economic rent, in this whole equation. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So, the point that I want to make here is that what we see in Peel is a rentierization of the land, of God's assets. And we think that this is something that's been dealt with at length in Brett Christopher's book on the subject of the rise of the rentier in the United Kingdom. We think what Warden Swingedow described as assetization, we look at it as a weaponization of the wealth chain. Next slide, please. This is some background on the other name, the Grosvenor family. Goes back to 1066. The Duke of Grosvenor was one of the richest men in England for many years, according to the Sunday Times rich list. This is inherited money. Next slide, please. The Grosvenor Group is the largest privately owned global property group, one of the largest privately owned property groups. The group is organized so it can simultaneously function as developer, investor, and fund manager. And in its fund manager's role, it invests and manages assets primarily in the retail, residential, and office sectors in over 60 cities around the world. So this is not small potatoes. They are everywhere. What we got from one of the academics we spoke to was this, I think, telling quote on Grosvenor. He says, "I don't know what your sense is, but one of the big landowners in Kensington, who also owns large swathes of Liverpool, is Grosvenor. And it's just so cruel. I mean, they own 450,000 square meters of Liverpool, which is like Leicester. They own Leicester city centre in Liverpool. It's bonkers. 250 years. It's like, well, you know, they've got all the cards." Could we press on to the next slide? Let me just say why Grosvenor is important. Is Grosvenor undertook the regeneration project for Liverpool 1. What's interesting about that regeneration project was the investment cost was 500 million, and the investment value was 920 million. I think that we need to talk about that difference. Let me press on in the interest of time. Could we skip this one? Yes, okay. What the interviews did for us was highlight that in Liverpool, the extraction of value comes from two sources representing two very different fractions of the British establishment. First is the new corporate rentier using rent extraction as a business strategy. And second, the age-old aristocrats whose business has always been the extraction of rents, who now combine the age-old practice with clever uses of shell companies and clever manipulation of the balance sheet. Please go to the next slide. Now, studentification was a big answer in our interviews. Everybody virtually spoke about studentification, and particularly the academics. I suppose it concerns academics most. Could we go to the next slide? What we found in the interviews was the local councillors were more amenable to investment coming from the offshore. And I mean, this is understandable for a number of reasons. But what we also found out from the interviews is that universities were actively recruiting foreign students because that was the cash cow in terms of filling their halls of residence. We think that the pandemic has brought that home in a real way for all universities in England. Next slide, please. Okay, so we were curious as to why there was no pushback or opposition from residents. And so what we did was basically use Stuart Hall's ideas on ideology and try to give an explanation of why we thought there was the absence of pushback. Next slide, please. You've got two contrasting responses there, representing a range of opinion. One is from an activist, the other is from a housing association representative. The next slide, thank you. And you've got the same kind of contrasting viewpoints in this slide as well. Could we go to the next slide? So in a paper called The Great Moving Right Show, basically Stuart Hall kind of shows us how the ideological high ground was won by the radical Tories of Margaret Thatcher in the 1970s. And basically, he argues that the right re-established its monopoly over good ideas, capitalism, and the free market. They will come back into usage as common usage as terms of positive appeal. What we basically say in this section of the paper is if we look back to the 1970s and we look at the ideological work done by Thatcher, by the radical right, you will see, you can believe that when we put this alongside some of the responses from our local councillors in particular, they seem to be very influenced by these arguments. So we're kind of arguing here that we're in a neoliberal period with neoliberal ideas still dominating the landscape. And in order for ideas to triumph, in order for, say, neoliberal ideas to triumph over Keynesian ideas, a lot of ideological work had to be done. Basically, we're saying, I suppose, to the left, is that if you want to change things for the better, then you have to be prepared to do the same amount of ideological work in the background. I'll stop there. I did rather jump over the last bits. I got too involved in the earlier section of the paper, and I wasn't really able to really show you what the interviews, the contrast in the interviews, but I hope you got some idea of what we're trying to do with it.
Thank you very much, Rex. I've got a lot of ideas already. I think other people may have as well. I will ask everyone to ask questions in the chat box. So you can type a Q there, and then I can give you the floor and you can turn your mic on, or you can just type your question there. In a minute, I'm going to watch there. I'll take my liberty as chair to ask the first question. Could you say a little bit more about the studentification, and not so much about the students, but what exactly is being invested in? Are these rich folks buying a property for their daughter or son who will be studying in Liverpool? Or are these people buying properties, maybe a whole complex that they invest in or part of a complex? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, one of the things that I skipped over was the Grosvenor investment in property. They're basically investing in a hotel, a long extended stay hotel, right close to the university, which sleeps a lot of people in a rather small space. So one type of investment is that corporate investment coming from the likes of Grosvenor. The other type of investment is the investment you spoke of, where you've got individual families, say a Chinese family, for instance, buying a place for their sons or daughter while they attend university in Liverpool. Now, these, we think, don't come through those big offshores. but come through the other smaller offshores.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Darius made a good point in the chat while I was speaking about Chinese students. Now, every respondent we spoke to spoke about Chinese students, every one of them, without hesitation. So in Liverpool, you've got studentification is aligned with the Chinese. And we got two different kind of bits of feedback. We got the councillors who saw this as a triumph, and academics and activists who questioned the model. i.e., that is to say, are universities sustainable with foreign offshore capital and foreign students? So that is basically the kind of response we got. And we think that there's corporate investors, people building hotels, buy-to-let places, and then there are the individual mom and dad. But we couldn't break down the figures behind mom and dad. We tried, but we couldn't get any kind of an estimate.
Okay, thank you, Rex. I see there are several questions now in the chat. I will ask these people one by one if they want to ask it themselves to have a little bit more interaction. So I'll be starting with Darek, the chair of the Financial Geography Network.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Rex. My question is, if I got it right from your presentation, this rise in offshore investments in Liverpool is relatively recent. And so why do you think this is the case? Because the legal tools used, the financial tools, are very well established for decades, if not some of them centuries. So is it that the city has become a more fashionable target of such investments? How do you explain that?
Yeah, the city is definitely more fashionable. If you take the Liverpool of the 1980s, there used to be a TV program called Boys from the Black Stuff. This was a TV program about with unemployed men in Liverpool. And if you take that image and put it next to the rebranding, the City of Culture, there's quite a stark difference. So Liverpool has this twin aspect. It's this, modern international city, but it's this city which has got a gritty side, which is a hangover from the 20th century. I would say in part because of the branding, but also if you read the paper, there are a lot of alternative asset managers investing in Liverpool. And I think that is because since the great financial crisis, interest rate returns have been low. And so investors, alternative managers are looking for higher yields. So some combination of those two, I think, has made Liverpool a very interesting proposition for property investors.
Thank you. Len, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Hi, Rex. That was a really, really interesting presentation. I happened to do my PhD in Liverpool just over 3 years ago. I didn't publish in view of I had a libel threat from one of the key actors in Liverpool who was connected to some very, very scary people, one of whom was a billionaire based in Lancashire who had underwritten about 30 failed schemes, but always got all of his money back. I did go down the route of the land registry foreign ownership data, but found that a little bit fruitless in terms of the limitations of the data. Foreign ownership in Liverpool is absolutely massive, and it's facilitated through a mechanism called fractional sales. I don't know if you looked at that, but that was strongly linked to some high-profile failures, one of which was the new Chinatown scheme in Liverpool, Very happy to talk to you for good reasons. I didn't publish the PhD because I preferred to sort of wake up in my bed without company, if you know what I mean, from the mafia figures. But there are whole mechanisms of shell companies, and they don't necessarily involve. My discovery in the PhD was actually our corporate regime is so lax in the UK that actually there's no point in going to Jersey or any of the jurisdictions. There is so little policing, and it's so easy to set up shell companies. So just wondered whether you actually looked at that side of things with particularly the investment in the student market.
We looked at some of the failures, Chinatown in particular, but we didn't have enough space to include that work in this particular paper. But we did look at it. There's a whole set of different things coming out of this that we would like to follow up, time permitting. And one of them is what came over very powerfully was the local councillors. Kind of, evidence of thinking of what Joe Penny calls a local rentier state, with, the city and its infrastructure being on sale all of the time to the highest bidders. Now, we were able to discern that in the interviews, especially the interviews with the officials. I guess you can understand why they feel like that. There's the austerities imposed by central government, etc., etc. That must be part of it. But we also found, as you probably know, lax regulations in Liverpool in terms of planning. And I entirely agree with you in terms of our regulation. It's wide open. It costs barely nothing to open a shell company. And one of the things I think about the offshore, the offshore kind of disappears between economics, accounting, geography, so it doesn't fall into a particular area. And because of the difficulty with data, the kind of data problems we have in the industry. It's not often studied, but approximately 1/3 in this range, 1/3 to 1/2 of all capital flows in the world pass through offshore centers. Now, for that alone, I think it's worth digging deeply into what is moving through offshore centers. Unfortunately, I don't know many people that are doing that. Manuel has told me that in Canada, there's some literature devoted to this. I would certainly like to follow up on that, but I absolutely agree with you. I'll go a little bit further. I sometimes wonder if this is not just by design. Some of the things seem so, how is that possible? Is this not an incentive? If you're stinking, filthy rich, aren't you incentivized to use the offshore? You know what I mean? These are the things that I think as I do this work. I hope I've answered the question.
No, you have. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Len and Rex. Karen, I see your question was more of a comment, but if you like, you can share it with Rex and the others.
Thanks, Manuel. You're right. It's more of a comment, but I'm happy to kind of follow up with a question as well. Thank you, Rex, for the really interesting presentation. Kind of my comment was kind of about the fact that if you talk about studentification, as you've rightly pointed to, that there are many different strategies, right, and many things going on. But I was wondering in terms of, so who is kind of largely responsible or driving, right, some of this studentification in terms of I'm thinking that on the Durham side, for example, which is where I'm based, right, there's a lot of pushback from local communities with regards to studentification. I'm sure that's going on in Liverpool as well. But there's always been a lot of uncertainty in terms of, because it's not about just lobbying the university, because a lot of the developments are not done by the university. Yeah, even though in your presentation you seem to hint that the university that is a substantive landowner, right? At least it's some of the ones in Liverpool. In Durham, that isn't the case. So a lot of the developments are private. So then a lot of the responsibilities and the lobbying then goes down to the local council in terms of the kinds of permits and permissions that they're allowing for homes of multiple occupancy and so on. So I'm just wondering, what's the balance of local council versus universities and so on in the case that you're looking at in Liverpool?
Difficult to answer, but tentatively, it's my impression that the university and the universities and the local councils are partnered in this thrust to attract students from overseas. They're slightly different to Durham. For instance, one of the universities we know from the interviews is a major landholder. And in the words of one of the respondents, had built right up to the boundaries, built student accommodation right up to the boundaries. So a situation might be a little bit different in Liverpool, where I'm seeing a lot of university-built properties. In terms of who else is buying, the corporates are buying in. They see profit, they see rents that they want to get at. The corporates are buying in, but then the difficulty is that mom and pop, who are also buying for their children, and that is a complete blind spot here. So I hope that that helps somewhat. I think the situation in Durham might be slightly different from it is to Liverpool.
It's also a lot smaller as well, so.
Yeah. Let me just say, somebody's just mentioned Ireland there. Ireland plays a significant part in the offshore business. A lot of the funds coming from Luxembourg go through Ireland and then back to Luxembourg and then into London. But you see Ireland over and over again if you follow the chain.
Okay, thank you, Karen and Rex again. Then there's also a question by Stefan.
Yeah, thank you, Rex, for this presentation. Before the others joined, you said you're an economist and you normally present to economists, and many of them are not known to read across, read other disciplinary work and these type of things. But you really did this really well. I think deep engagement across disciplines, and I wondered how your colleagues react when you present your research. Yeah,
it's a bit mixed. There's some people who don't believe I'm doing economics at all. I'm doing something else. There's some who think it's really important work, but on the whole, I'm kind of on the back foot with my colleagues in economics because they don't see it as being bona fide. I don't see it they don't see it as being bona fide economics. When I go and use interview techniques, I think I make it worse for myself. And then when I quote from Manuel, or I quote from Ward, or I quote from these people, it really is bad. I won't say that I have been abused, but I have been spoken to quite strongly about the need to do economics and not play around with geographers. I take a completely different view. You can probably tell that. The influences on me are many and come from many different disciplines, and I think we all have something to contribute. In the group that I work with, we have another economist, we have a geographer, and we have a criminologist, and I like that interdisciplinary exchange. And I actually think that, and I won't say this too loud in case it gets back, but I think economists could learn a lot from what the geographers have been doing over the last 20 or 30 years. So I'm happy to go this route, notwithstanding what some people might say in economics.
This is, of course, something we very much like to hear. And it's rare to hear an economist say these things. There are other economists who have been active in financial geography, but they are also exceptions, I think. And there's been some people who've been really supportive also, like Gary Dimsky from the early onwards that we started with FinGeo. But we've always intended it to be very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. And I think, in fact, some of the people involved in running it have mixed backgrounds as well. I think that's quite typical for geographers, not to have a geography background, but also something else. So I think that also makes it easier to have a dialogue with people in other disciplines. And it's great that you are one of those people having the dialogue with us. I see there's no more questions in the chat, but we have a few more minutes. So I will do one more question myself. You were talking about some of the money being invested by people from the UK through the tax haven and then back into the UK, while some of the other tax havens were being used for people who are already abroad who invest through the tax haven, either for secrecy reasons or also to evade taxes. But do you have any idea how much of it is round tripping? So UK, tax haven, UK, or yeah, how much is overseas tax haven into UK? No,
I don't.
No.
The short answer is no, I don't. It's really something of interest. I mean, how many Brits own second homes, but own them through the offshore?
Mm-hmm.
That is a big question. I would certainly like to attack the question and try to get some answers. But in thinking about it, it really proved to be, I mean, you could do fancy kind of Bayesian modeling and kind of get some kind of estimate. So maybe that's the way to go, but it's not easily done because the whole thing about the offshore is that the identity of owners is hidden. We just don't know the identity. So, you know, I couldn't find an easy way to get to that. And certainly with the resources that we have at our disposal, it wasn't worth trying to pursue at this stage, but maybe at another stage, yes, definitely a big question.
Okay, many thanks, Rex. I see we're 1 minute to 6 in my local time, so 1 minute to 5 in the UK, and whatever other time you are somewhere else. So I'm going to be rounding up now. I'd like to thank you again, Rex. It was a great opening of our new series. I'm looking forward to read it in more detail, and I think it's going to be very challenging to see how this is going to develop further, because I see you have a larger project on it. I would love to see more. I'm also wondering, you know, I think it's very interesting. You look at it in a different kind of location than people have done before. You know, I looked at London, New York, people have looked at Vancouver, Toronto, Paris, but now, yeah, this is a different kind of location. If other people are going to do this too, well, I think it's going to be an interesting question, what's going to pop up. So I also look forward to see what else is coming out of your project with your colleagues in different disciplines and different universities. In 2 weeks, we'll be back with another FinGeo seminar. It will be Madeline Fairbairn from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And she will be presenting on farmland investment, environmental uncertainty, and racialized dispossession in the US. I'm not going to post the link here because all of you have already seen it, because it's the same link that you needed to register for Rex's lecture. So I hope to see most of you again in 2 weeks, same time, different Zoom meeting, but I hope to see you there. Thanks a lot and have a nice evening, everyone.